Germany, May 1945. The war had ended. But the silence that followed was heavier than any artillery barrage. In the American-occupied zone near Frankfurt, the morning mist clung to the wooden fences of a freshly established POW camp. Rows of barbed wire shimmered faintly in the pale sun. Beyond them stood a line of German women, once clerks, nurses, and auxiliaries of the Wehrmacht, now prisoners of a war that had devoured their homeland. They held brooms and buckets instead of rifles or radios. Their uniforms, stripped of insignia, hung loosely, remnants of a past erased overnight. Inside the barracks, young American soldiers watched in uneasy quiet as the women were ordered to clean the very floors those soldiers slept on. The air carried the scent of soap, damp wood, and unspoken judgment. No one laughed. No one shouted. For the first time, power and shame occupied the same room, and both sides seemed uncertain who truly bore the heavier burden. But to understand how German women ended up in American custody, cleaning the barracks of their conquerors, we must step back to the chaotic final days of the Reich. The collapse of the Reich, May 1945. The fall of Nazi Germany was not a single moment, but a slow, disintegrating unraveling. By early May, the Third Reich, once stretching from the Pyrenees to the gates of Moscow, had collapsed into silence and surrender. Allied convoys rolled across the broken autobahns, their tires crushing glass, ash, and the last illusions of Hitler's empire. In every town, white flags fluttered from windows once adorned with swastikas. Among the millions surrendering were not only soldiers, but also thousands of women who had served the regime in uniform. They were typists, signal operators, nurses, and administrative aides in the Wehrmacht, Luftwaffe, and SS support branches. For years, propaganda had portrayed them as loyal daughters of Germany, devoted to Führer, Volk, und Vaterland. Now they were prisoners of a vanished state, standing before their captors without a nation, without protection, and often without even a clear charge. The Allied forces had anticipated the surrender of armies, not the influx of women in field-gray uniforms. Many were captured on roadsides, attempting to return home after units disbanded. Others were taken when hospitals and communication centers were seized. Their roles were clerical, but their association with the war machine made them part of its aftermath, the living remnants of a system the world wanted to erase. The American Army's rapid occupation of Southerns and Western Germany created an administrative nightmare. Between May and July 1945, more than 5 million German POWs came under U.S. control. Among them, several thousand were women. While most male prisoners were processed, counted, and confined under the Geneva Convention, women occupied an uncertain status. They were not combatants, yet they had worn the uniform of the defeated army. They were not civilians, yet they were not treated as criminals. For the Americans, they became a logistical and moral question: what to do with the women of a fallen enemy. Conditions in the early camps were harsh, but not intentionally cruel. Makeshift barbed wire enclosures were erected in open fields or former Wehrmacht compounds. Food was rationed, bedding scarce, and sanitation improvised. Soldiers and officers were exhausted. Discipline was rigid. For many women, the first days in captivity were marked not by violence, but by humiliation. The stripping of insignia, the issuance of numbered tags, and the realization that their authority and identity had vanished overnight. For the U.S. command, the task was monumental. The German surrender had to be managed with efficiency and fairness under international law. American officers, many only in their 20s, suddenly found themselves responsible for entire towns of defeated enemies. The Geneva Convention outlined the humane treatment of prisoners, food, shelter, medical care, but said little about dignity. And dignity, in this new world of reversed power, was often the first casualty. The women themselves represented a paradox that confounded their captors. Some had served willingly, imbued with Nazi ideology. Others had been conscripted or coerced into service as the war dragged on. To the Americans, they were both a threat and a reflection of the enemy's human face. The enemy's mothers, sisters, daughters. Their presence blurred the moral simplicity of victory. It was easier to hate the soldier who had fired a rifle than the woman who had typed his orders or tended his wounds. In many camps, these women were separated from male POWs, but kept nearby for logistical reasons. Some were tasked with domestic duties, cleaning, laundry, kitchen work, under military supervision. To U.S. officers, this was a matter of hygiene and order. To the women, it was an enforced ritual of humiliation. The image of a German uniform, once a symbol of pride, reduced to a cleaning rag in an American barracks, carried a psychological weight deeper than punishment. It was a silent acknowledgement of total defeat. Outside the wire, the landscape mirrored their despair. Cities lay in ruin: Cologne, Frankfurt, Nuremberg, all reduced to blackened skeletons. Millions of refugees wandered the roads, searching for food and lost family. The Allied forces faced not just an occupied nation, but a humanitarian catastrophe. Amid this chaos, the presence of captured German women seemed a small issue, yet it carried profound symbolic meaning. Their treatment would become a measure of how the victors understood justice after victory. And so, in the early summer of 1945, as the U.S. military established order in a defeated land, the fate of these women became entwined with the moral question of what it meant to be civilized after total war. The answer would unfold in the daily routines, in the simple, degrading tasks, and in the quiet tension between mercy and memory. The collapse of the Reich, May 1945. The fall of Nazi Germany was not a single moment, but a slow, disintegrating unraveling. By early May, the Third Reich, once stretching from the Pyrenees to the gates of Moscow, had collapsed into silence and surrender. Allied convoys rolled across the broken autobahns, their tires crushing glass, ash, and the last illusions of Hitler's empire. In every town, white flags fluttered from windows once adorned with swastikas. Among the millions surrendering were not only soldiers, but also thousands of women who had served the regime in uniform. They were typists, signal operators, nurses, and administrative aides in the Wehrmacht, Luftwaffe, and SS support branches. For years, propaganda had portrayed them as loyal daughters of Germany, devoted to Führer, Volk und Vaterland. Now they were prisoners of a vanished state, standing before their captors without a nation, without protection, and often without even a clear charge. The Allied forces had anticipated the surrender of armies, not the influx of women in field-gray uniforms. Many were captured on roadsides, attempting to return home after units disbanded. Others were taken when hospitals and communication centers were seized. Their roles were clerical, but their association with the war machine made them part of its aftermath. The living remnants of a system the world wanted to erase. The American Army's rapid occupation of southern and western Germany created an administrative nightmare. Between May and July 1945, more than 5 million German POWs came under U.S. control. Among them, several thousand were women. While most male prisoners were processed, counted, and confined under the Geneva Convention, women occupied an uncertain status. They were not combatants, yet they had worn the uniform of the defeated army. They were not civilians, yet they were not treated as criminals. For the Americans, they became a logistical and moral question: what to do with the women of a fallen enemy. Conditions in the early camps were harsh, but not intentionally cruel. Makeshift barbed wire enclosures were erected in open fields or former Wehrmacht compounds. Food was rationed, bedding scarce, and sanitation improvised. Soldiers and officers were exhausted. Discipline was rigid. For many women, the first days in captivity were marked not by violence, but by humiliation. The stripping of insignia, the issuance of numbered tags, and the realization that their authority and identity had vanished overnight. For the U.S. command, the task was monumental. The German surrender had to be managed with efficiency and fairness under international law. American officers, many only in their 20s, suddenly found themselves responsible for entire towns of defeated enemies. The Geneva Convention outlined the humane treatment of prisoners: food, shelter, medical care. but said little about dignity. And dignity, in this new world of reversed power, was often the first casualty. The women themselves represented a paradox that confounded their captors. Some had served willingly, imbued with Nazi ideology. Others had been conscripted or coerced into service as the war dragged on. To the Americans, they were both a threat and a reflection of the enemy's human face. The enemy's mothers, sisters, daughters. Their presence blurred the moral simplicity of victory. It was easier to hate the soldier who had fired a rifle than the woman who had typed his orders or tended his wounds. In many camps, these women were separated from male POWs, but kept nearby for logistical reasons. Some were tasked with domestic duties, cleaning, laundry, kitchen work, under military supervision. To U.S. officers, this was a matter of hygiene and order. To the women, it was an enforced ritual of humiliation. The image of a German uniform, once a symbol of pride, reduced to a cleaning rag in an American barracks, carried a psychological weight deeper than punishment. It was a silent acknowledgement of total defeat. Outside the wire, the landscape mirrored their despair. Cities lay in ruin: Cologne, Frankfurt, Nuremberg, all reduced to blackened skeletons. Millions of refugees wandered the roads, searching for food and lost family. The Allied forces faced not just an occupied nation, but a humanitarian catastrophe. Amid this chaos, the presence of captured German women seemed a small issue, yet it carried profound symbolic meaning. Their treatment would become a measure of how the victors understood justice after victory. And so, in the early summer of 1945, as the U.S. military established order in a defeated land, the fate of these women became entwined with the moral question of what it meant to be civilized after total war. The answer would unfold in the daily routines, in the simple, degrading tasks, and in the quiet tension between mercy and memory. The occupation begins. By June 1945, the American military administration had fully taken control of its zones in Germany: Bavaria, Hesse, Württemberg, and parts of Thuringia. Under General Dwight D. Eisenhower's directive, every captured German soldier, male or female, was to be processed according to Allied Control Council policy. Camps were organized with military precision: fenced perimeters, numbered barracks, centralized kitchens, and guard towers. Order replaced chaos, but at a human cost few could measure. The American camps were far from the brutal reputation of Soviet captivity, where starvation and vengeance often defined survival. Yet even in U.S. hands, conditions were austere. Prisoners were expected to work, not as punishment, but as a means of reconstruction and self-discipline. The idea was simple. Germany had destroyed itself through militarism. Now it would rebuild through labor. For men, that meant clearing rubble, repairing bridges, or unloading military supplies. For women, the tasks were less visible, but no less symbolic. In dozens of camps across occupied Germany, female POWs were assigned to maintain American facilities, washing uniforms, scrubbing latrines, cleaning kitchens, and sweeping barracks. These duties, justified as routine camp maintenance, became acts of forced acknowledgement. Every mop stroke across an American floor felt like an erasure of the Reich's imagined superiority. For many, humiliation replaced hunger as the hardest burden to bear. American officers were instructed to treat all prisoners according to the Geneva Convention. No unnecessary hardship, no physical abuse. But the convention had been written with male combatants in mind. It had no provisions for the moral dimensions of female captivity. The line between necessity and humiliation blurred. Reports from Red Cross observers noted cases where women were tasked with cleaning under armed supervision, sometimes while soldiers watched silently. There were no recorded assaults, yet the atmosphere was charged with shame and discomfort on both sides. For American guards, often barely older than the prisoners, the situation was equally complex. Many had fought through France or the Ardennes, seen friends die in German ambushes, and now stood face to face with the human remnants of that enemy. To some, watching German women scrub the barracks floors felt like justice. To others, it felt wrong. an unnecessary humiliation in a war that was already won. The moral tension of victory hung heavy in those quiet camps. To understand why such orders existed, one must look to the logistical realities of post-war Germany. American barracks, supply depots, and field hospitals required constant upkeep. With local economies shattered and civilian labor disorganized, the only available workforce was the one already under guard. Thousands of German POWs, both men and women, became an unpaid army of laborers. The Allies justified this under Article 31 of the Geneva Convention, which allowed non-military labor not directly connected with the operations of the war. Cleaning, cooking, and maintenance fell neatly within those rules. But on the ground, these regulations took on emotional meaning. For the German women, many of whom had joined military service for duty or survival, being ordered to clean the living quarters of American soldiers was not just labor. It was symbolic defeat. It reversed the hierarchy that Nazi ideology had burned into them for years. The master race was now mopping the floors of its conquerors, and yet many complied silently. Not out of obedience, but because silence was the only dignity left. Inside the wire, time lost meaning. Days were marked by routines: morning roll call, cleaning assignments, brief rations, evening lockup. Letters were censored, newspapers banned. The only sound of freedom was the rumble of American trucks beyond the fence, moving toward the cities where the future of Europe was being rebuilt. For the women behind the wire, the war had ended, but their reckoning had only begun. Meanwhile, the American command faced its own questions. Reports from some camps described German civilians volunteering to help the captured women, bringing food, clothing, or moral support, acts that were quietly discouraged. The U.S. wanted to maintain authority, to demonstrate both justice and strength. Allowing sympathy to blur those lines risked undermining the psychological goal of occupation: to break the remnants of Nazi pride. The orders were clear: discipline first, mercy later. And yet mercy did exist, in quiet moments. Some guards allowed extra food. Others looked away when a prisoner wept. Red Cross inspections brought small improvements: blankets, soap, medical attention. Slowly, the camps began to transform from instruments of control into zones of reflection. Within those wire fences, former enemies began to see each other not as monsters or victors, but as human beings caught in history's machinery. Still, the image of German women cleaning American barracks remained a powerful symbol, a tableau of humiliation, duty, and uneasy conscience. It captured the strange morality of post-war life, a world where justice, dignity, and survival had no clear borders. But humiliation has many faces, and each reflected a different angle of post-war reckoning. The human angle: silence, shame, and survival. For most of the German women taken prisoner in May 1945, the war did not end with surrender. It ended with silence. The silence of shame. They were no longer soldiers, yet not civilians either. They had lost their uniforms, their homes, and the ideological world that had once given them purpose. When they were ordered to clean the American barracks, that silence became their only defense, the last remnant of control in a world stripped bare of identity. In camp reports and post-war testimonies, women recalled the moment not as cruelty, but as humiliation. A nurse from Kassel later told a Red Cross interviewer, "We were not beaten. We were not starved, but when they gave us brushes and said, 'Clean,' I felt as if every eye on me was laughing. There was no laughter, only the crushing awareness of reversal. The conquerors watched. The defeated obeyed. And yet beneath the humiliation was something more complex. A strange endurance. Many women adapted, forming small groups for comfort. They shared rations, whispered prayers, and traded stories of lost brothers or bombed cities. Cleaning became ritual, not of servitude, but of survival. Each scrubbed floor was a quiet declaration: "I am still here. I will live through this too." In that sense, captivity did what the war had failed to do. It humanized them. The propaganda, the symbols, the speeches, all dissolved in the smell of soap and the echo of footsteps in wooden barracks. What remained were people, weary, stripped of ideology, trying to find fragments of self-respect amid defeat. The tactical angle. Order in the ruins from the American command's perspective. The scene was less moral than practical. Germany was in ruins, roads clogged with refugees, cities reduced to dust, disease threatening to spread. Within weeks of victory, the U.S. Army was responsible for feeding, housing, and controlling millions of surrendered soldiers. The entire system teetered on collapse. Every camp needed structure. Every day required routine. Clean barracks, clean kitchens, clean latrines. Not as symbols, but as survival measures. Typhus, dysentery, and influenza were already emerging in the crowded compounds. In this light, the order for POWs, including women, to clean facilities was not vindictive. It was essential. Military documents from the U.S. 7th Army's Civil Affairs Division recorded the assignment of hygiene duties to female auxiliary personnel in accordance with camp maintenance regulations. The Americans viewed the act through a lens of discipline. Labor equaled control. In the Army's moral code, order was virtue, and chaos was the enemy. The command believed that forcing captured personnel to contribute to the upkeep of camps instilled responsibility, prevented idleness, and restored a sense of routine that mirrored military structure. But what the paperwork didn't record was the emotional theater unfolding beneath that logic. The Americans saw labor. The women felt punishment. Both were correct. To the soldiers enforcing the order, cleanliness symbolized civilization reclaiming itself from the dirt of war. To the women scrubbing those floors, it symbolized submission, the physical act of erasing their former power. What began as hygiene became a lesson in humility, taught not by intention, but by circumstance. In a war defined by ideology, even soap and water carried meaning. The cultural angle, reversal of power. The image of German women cleaning American barracks was more than daily routine. It was cultural theater. For years, Nazi propaganda had glorified female service as noble and pure. Helpers of the homeland, defenders of the fatherland's moral strength. They were shown in posters standing beside soldiers, loyal and dignified, guardians of the Reich's honor. Now that image lay shattered on the wooden floors of Allied barracks. In the eyes of the Americans, the reversal was undeniable. The same nation that had once sought to dominate Europe through ruthless efficiency now knelt to scrub its conquerors' quarters. The symbolism resonated deeply. Photographs taken by U.S. Army journalists, though rarely published, captured women in tattered Wehrmacht skirts, cleaning under watchful guards. No brutality, no spectacle, just quiet humiliation in the name of duty. For post-war Germany, this reversal of power became one of the earliest lessons of defeat. Women had been among the most visible faces of Nazi discipline. Orderly, obedient, devoted. Their fall from that pedestal mirrored the collapse of the ideology itself. The women who once served the Reich now served soap and water under foreign flags. The transformation was not simply physical, it was cultural repentance enacted in silence. And yet, this reversal also revealed something unexpected about both sides. The Americans, despite victory, felt unease. Many guards expressed discomfort at the sight of women, some barely 20, performing such tasks under supervision. A private from the 99th Infantry Division wrote in his diary, "They looked ashamed, and I guess we did too." War turns everyone into something they never planned to be. The scene thus became a mirror, each side seeing in the other what they feared most. For the Americans, the capacity for cruelty, even indecency. For the Germans, the collapse of pride beneath the weight of defeat. It was no longer a question of power. It was a question of what remained of humanity after power was gone. But humiliation was never one-sided. Behind those quiet duties, both conqueror and conquered wrestled with guilt, compassion, and the blurred morality of victory. And in that fragile space between authority and empathy, new tensions emerged, ones that would soon shape the moral landscape of occupation. The American perspective. Victory's burden. For many young American soldiers, Germany in the summer of 1945 was their first taste of peace, and it was bitter. They had survived Normandy, the Ardennes, the Rhine. They had seen what German forces had done in France and Belgium. They had marched through towns littered with rubble and civilian corpses. Now, standing guard over prisoners and watching German women clean the barracks they lived in, victory felt strangely hollow. The U.S. Army prided itself on discipline and restraint. Orders from General Eisenhower and Chef, Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, emphasized humane treatment of prisoners. The Army wanted to prove that America's victory was moral, not just military. Yet on the ground, the moral line blurred daily. The sight of former enemies performing menial labor satisfied a primitive sense of justice, and at the same time, provoked discomfort. Many soldiers described it in letters home not with pride, but with unease. One sergeant from the 3rd Infantry Division wrote, "They don't look like the enemy anymore. Just tired women with no place left to go." Others admitted that seeing German women scrub their floors felt wrong. Too much like revenge, as one corporal put it. For the Americans, the humiliation of the enemy carried an emotional toll. They were victors asked to act as administrators, judges, and moral guardians. A role few were trained for. Some guards maintained strict professionalism. Others sought distance by dehumanizing the prisoners, referring to them only by numbers or duties. But many were simply confused. The war had taught them that the enemy was monstrous. Yet here stood the enemy, fragile and defeated, with eyes full of shame. This internal tension, between duty and empathy, defined much of the early occupation. The Americans had conquered Germany, but not their own conscience. Every act of control demanded justification. Every moment of compassion risked accusation of weakness. In the end, most chose silence. And silence, like discipline, kept the system intact. The psychological angle. Humiliation as reconstruction. Humiliation has often been used in history as a weapon. But in post-war Germany, it became something else, an instrument of moral reconstruction. The Allies did not intend to humiliate the German people for cruelty's sake. They sought to dismantle the mental architecture of fascism, the belief in superiority, obedience, and destiny. The process began not with speeches, but with small acts that inverted the old order. When German women were ordered to clean American barracks, the message was implicit. The Reich's power was over, and responsibility had replaced privilege. Humiliation was not written into policy, but it became a psychological mechanism, a way to reprogram behavior without violence. Psychologists attached to the U.S. Army's Information Control Division later described this phenomenon as deconditioning. In practical terms, it meant dismantling the authoritarian reflex, replacing pride with reflection. The Americans had learned from the mistakes of 1918, when Germany's humiliation after World War I bred resentment. This time, the aim was not vengeance but transformation. Still, humiliation is never neutral. For many women, it was a private wound that never healed. The act of cleaning for the victors burned deeper than physical labor. It challenged their sense of identity, their belief in purpose. Some internalized guilt, others defiance. A few even described it as a relief, a cleansing in both literal and moral sense. As one auxiliary from Munich recalled decades later, "It was hard, yes, but maybe it was what we deserved. It made us see that we were not special, just human again." In that quiet, moral inversion lay the foundation of West Germany's future, a society rebuilt on humility rather than arrogance. The psychological weight of defeat, felt by men and women alike, became the unseen groundwork of democracy. And among those who had scrubbed the barracks of the victors, the lesson was intimate. Power, once lost, can never be justified again by ideology alone. The gender angle. Redefining the German woman before 1945. The image of the German woman was rigidly defined by the Nazi ideal: disciplined, dutiful, and devoted to nation and family. She was the Trümmerfrau in waiting, though the rubble was not yet visible. She was the silent worker behind the soldier, the mother of the master race, the pillar of purity in a world of conquest. When the Reich fell, that image shattered, and inside the POW camps, its reconstruction began in unexpected ways. The humiliation of captivity was not merely national, it was gendered. To be a woman in uniform, a symbol of the Reich's order, and then to be reduced to domestic servitude under a foreign army was a profound inversion. It forced German women to confront their own place within the machinery of war. They had been complicit, not in combat, but in function. Many had served willingly in the bureaucracy that enabled the regime's crimes. Others had believed in the illusion of duty and honor. Now, in cleaning American barracks, they faced the symbolic dismantling of that illusion. Sociologists studying post-war gender roles noted that these experiences contributed to a wider redefinition of womanhood in Germany. After captivity, many former auxiliaries rejected the militarized femininity of the Nazi era. They became nurses, teachers, and administrators in the reconstruction effort, roles that emphasized care and rebuilding rather than discipline and hierarchy. Humiliation, in this sense, became transformation. It stripped away the ideological armor and exposed the human core beneath. The obedient helper of the Reich became the pragmatic survivor of the Republic. At the same time, the American soldiers, many from rural or working-class backgrounds, carried their own notions of gender, shaped by 1940s America, where chivalry and authority coexisted uneasily. The sight of women prisoners forced into cleaning blurred those notions as well. Some guards treated the women with exaggerated courtesy, calling them Miss instead of Fräulein. Others avoided speaking altogether, fearing misinterpretation. Both sides navigated the same fragile boundary between respect and power. By the late summer of 1945, this redefinition had begun to ripple outward. The German women who once scrubbed American floors would later rebuild German cities. Their humiliation became the crucible of a new identity, one forged not by propaganda, but by survival. Yet beneath these shifts, human, tactical, cultural, psychological, and gendered, the moral tension still simmered. It would soon reach a breaking point, when one ordinary day in an American camp transformed a silent ritual into a moment of reckoning that neither side would forget. Heidelberg, late May 1945. The camp sat on the outskirts of a quiet, broken city. Beyond the wire, Heidelberg's Baroque rooftops still glowed with sunlight, untouched by the bombings that had leveled so many other German towns. Inside the fence, however, the air was thick with dust, sweat, and unspoken resentment. Rows of makeshift wooden huts lined the gravel yard, guarded by the faded colors of American khaki and olive drab. At dawn, a formation of German women prisoners stood at attention. Their uniforms were gone, replaced by plain gray work dresses and armbands stenciled with black letters. PW. They waited in silence for orders that had already become routine, to clean the American barracks before inspection. The order came not from cruelty, but from bureaucracy. The camp commandant, a pragmatic lieutenant named John Hanley, had received notice of a pending inspection by headquarters. The camp had to be spotless. Food storage, sleeping quarters, and latrines were to be immaculate. There was no time or manpower to spare. Most American soldiers were preparing for redeployment or transport duties. The cleaning would fall to the prisoners, as always. By 0700 hours, the women were led toward the barracks compound. The guards said little. The rhythmic sound of boots and gravel filled the air. Inside, the barracks were still warm from the soldiers' sleep, the air thick with tobacco and sweat. Cots were pushed aside, floors scrubbed, blankets folded. One woman carried a pail so heavy it left a bruise on her forearm. Another paused by a soldier's bed, staring briefly at a photograph taped to the wall. An American girl smiling in front of a White House. For a heartbeat, the two worlds collided, the victor's home and the prisoner's shame. No one spoke. The Americans stood outside, some watching through the windows. Most looked away. One private, barely 20, later described the moment in his diary. They cleaned in silence, heads down. It didn't feel like victory anymore. It felt like judgment. Inside the barracks, a woman in her 30s, a former Luftwaffe signals operator, quietly directed the others. She was known among the guards as the sergeant, though her rank had long been stripped away. She had a scar across her left hand from an air raid, a memory of the war she once served proudly. Now she scrubbed the floor where American boots rested. The irony was not lost on anyone. As the morning stretched on, tension grew. A few of the soldiers began joking among themselves, nervous laughter, not malice. But to the women, every sound carried weight. One guard, trying to lighten the mood, played a swing tune on a field radio. The cheerful music, Benny Goodman's "Let's Dance," filled the barracks with a sound utterly foreign to their despair. The rhythm of brushes on wood faltered, then resumed. The prisoners kept their heads down, determined not to react. When the inspection team finally arrived, the barracks gleamed. Floors shone with soap water, bunks stood in perfect alignment, and even the brass door handles reflected sunlight. The American officer nodded in approval. "Good work," he said, but his voice carried across a silence that swallowed the compliment whole. As he turned to leave, one of the women, the same who had led the group, straightened her back. For a brief moment she met the officer's eyes, not in defiance but in something deeper, a silent statement of endurance, the kind of look only the defeated can give, stripped of everything yet unwilling to disappear. That small exchange, unnoticed by most, defined the day. Later that afternoon, a Red Cross observer arrived to conduct a routine inspection. His notes, preserved in the archives of the International Committee of the Red Cross, ICRC, recorded the event without sentiment. Prisoners assigned to domestic maintenance. Physical conditions satisfactory. Moral atmosphere subdued. Female internees display fatigue and resignation. But between the lines, the truth lived quietly. That morning had been more than cleaning duty. It was a ritual of reckoning. Both sides had confronted what victory and defeat truly meant when stripped of propaganda. After the day's work, the women returned to their section of the camp. They ate in silence. Thin soup, a slice of bread, black coffee. Outside, American soldiers smoked cigarettes and spoke of home. The divide between them was measured not by wire, but by memory. That night, as lights went out across the camp, Private Harold Kent, one of the guards, wrote another line in his pocket journal. "They worked like ghosts, and when they looked up at us, it wasn't fear. It was something else, something I don't think any of us will forget." In the grand scale of history, nothing remarkable had happened that day. No rebellion, no violence, no speech. Yet within that quiet day's labor, a moral transformation had begun. It was not written in orders or headlines. It lived in the silence between brooms and boots, the silence that follows a world's collapse. And that silence, more than any surrender document, marked the real end of the war for those who lived it. Heidelberg, June 1945. The official report filed by the camp's commandant was brief. It contained the usual logistics, number of prisoners, rations, labor hours. But appended at the end in careful handwriting was a single observation: discipline maintained, work completed without protest, notable display of composure among female POWs, no incidents recorded. To the bureaucrats reading it at headquarters, it was an unremarkable note, one of hundreds arriving daily from camps across occupied Germany. Yet, to the men who witnessed that morning in the barracks, it lingered like a quiet confession. For months, many of these American soldiers had carried with them an image of the enemy shaped by propaganda reels and combat trauma. The Wehrmacht, and by extension anyone in German uniform, had been reduced to a faceless machine of brutality. But now, with the war ended and women in custody scrubbing their floors, that narrative began to dissolve. Lieutenant Hanley, who had issued the cleaning order, later described the moment in an interview preserved at the U.S. Army Military History Institute. "They weren't soldiers anymore, and neither were we. It was like the war itself had walked out of the room, and we were left looking at the pieces." In the following weeks, American command faced increasing scrutiny over the treatment of prisoners. Allied occupation policy demanded humane conditions, and General Eisenhower himself had issued strict directives forbidding mistreatment or revenge. But rumors from other camps, especially in the French and Soviet zones, painted a grim contrast. Thus, even minor acts like the Heidelberg cleaning detail were scrutinized as moral indicators of how the victors handled the defeated. The Red Cross report circulated through Geneva in early July 1945, noting that female German internees are employed in sanitary and maintenance tasks consistent with Geneva Convention standards. It also added an understated but telling line: internees maintain an attitude of restraint and cooperation. American guards display awareness of humane oversight. In diplomatic terms, that was a commendation, but for the women themselves, it offered no comfort. Their humiliation was not in the physical labor, but in the symbolism, the reversal of everything they had been told about power, nation, and pride. One prisoner, identified only as K. Miller, later recounted her experience in a 1953 oral history collection at the Bundesarchiv in Koblenz. "I had worked in an air raid office in Berlin. We believed we were serving the fatherland, not committing crimes. But when I scrubbed that wooden floor in front of Americans, I felt something break inside me. Not hatred, but understanding. The war had made fools of us all." Historians later interpreted these testimonies not as moments of cruelty, but of moral confrontation, where propaganda collapsed under the weight of ordinary human contact. Dr. Elizabeth Kruger, in her 1981 study, Women in Captivity, the German female POW experience, described such scenes as unrecorded negotiations of dignity. They were not trials or punishments, yet they carried the psychological gravity of both. Meanwhile, the U.S. officers at Heidelberg began re-evaluating their role. The emotional dissonance of guarding women, some barely older than their sisters or wives, stirred questions that no training manual could answer. In a letter to his family, Sergeant Lewis Grant wrote, "They looked beaten, but proud. I thought of Mom cleaning our kitchen back home. Then I wondered what we'd do if the tables were turned." By mid-June, orders came to reduce non-essential labor assignments. The cleaning duties were rotated, and female prisoners were gradually reassigned to clerical work and food service under supervision. The camp atmosphere softened, tensions eased, yet something irreversible had already happened. The act of forcing former enemies to perform domestic work had illuminated a truth far larger than the walls of any camp, that even victory could carry its own quiet shame. This realization spread quietly among U.S. personnel. Some began documenting their observations more carefully, aware that they were witnessing a chapter history books would overlook. Others simply stopped giving unnecessary orders. For many, the experience left a scar of reflection deeper than combat. The psychological transformation also marked the beginning of what post-war scholars call the moral demobilization, the process by which victorious armies relearned humanity after years of total war. Heidelberg's camp became a microcosm of that shift. There were no photographs, no official ceremonies, no medals, only the enduring memory of a morning when the world's order had turned upside down and revealed its frailty. In the decades that followed, the event would resurface in memoirs, diaries, and interviews, often cited as a symbol of how ordinary actions can expose extraordinary truths. What happened in that barracks was not a grand battle or a political decision, but something far more intimate: the rediscovery of empathy amid the ruins of ideology. And as the last of those witnesses aged, many confessed the same realization, that war's greatest humiliation was not defeat itself, but the moment when both sides saw themselves reflected in each other's eyes. That understanding marked the true turning point, not only for the German women who scrubbed those floors, but for the Americans who watched them, and for history itself, struggling to make sense of what victory really meant. Germany, summer 1945. The guns had fallen silent, but the war's debris still shaped every breath of Europe. From ruined Berlin to the valleys of the Rhine, The continent was a geography of ghosts, burned cities, hollow factories, endless columns of displaced people. For the Allied forces now turned occupiers, the challenge had shifted from victory to management. Millions of POWs, refugees and civilians to feed, shelter, and re-educate. In this new reality, moments like the Heidelberg incident took on quiet administrative importance. The U.S. Army's command structure began evaluating how its treatment of prisoners, especially women, would reflect the values of the emerging post-war order. Every act of discipline or dignity carried symbolic weight in the fragile narrative of liberation. American reports from June through August 1945 show a visible change in tone. The Office of the Provost Marshal General issued revised labor directives, explicitly forbidding any task likely to induce unnecessary humiliation or moral injury. The language was bureaucratic, but the implication clear. The victors were expected to behave as models of restraint, not instruments of vengeance. At Heidelberg and other camps under the U.S. 7th Army's jurisdiction, new training lectures were introduced for guards. Sessions emphasizing the Geneva Convention, moral responsibility, and the preservation of dignity among internees. One memo from the 101st Military Government Detachment reads, "Every gesture toward humanity strengthens our claim to civilized victory. We must not win the war only to lose our conscience." Meanwhile, the Red Cross and relief organizations amplified these developments. Their inspection teams documented both compliance and exceptions, from well-run facilities like Heidelberg to overcrowded emergency camps near Remagen and Mannheim. These field reports, circulated among Allied command, helped establish the image of the American occupation as comparatively humane, an image Washington was eager to maintain amid the geopolitical friction with Soviet zones to the east. Within the camps, small but significant changes unfolded. Women prisoners began receiving structured assignments, clerical work, food preparation, and repair duties. Instead of menial cleaning, they were paid token wages in camp scrip, allowing them to buy soap, stationery, or extra rations from the canteen. Medical inspections became routine, and the Red Cross distributed parcels containing hygiene items and reading material. The transformation was not sentimental. It was procedural, deliberate, and monitored. Yet behind the regulations, there remained a sense of unfinished reckoning. The humiliation had not disappeared. It had only evolved into introspection. Letters, written by American officers from mid-1945, reveal that many continued to wrestle with the morality of their new role. Captain Arthur Mills, stationed near Stuttgart, wrote home, "It's strange. You expect to feel pride when you see them working, but instead you feel a kind of guilt. You realize how easily power can forget mercy." At the same time, German newspapers, under Allied supervision, began publishing stories of captured soldiers and civilians adapting to camp life. These reports were part of the broader denazification effort designed to portray re-education rather than punishment. Yet the undertone was unmistakable, a moral reordering of society, where humility and cooperation replaced fanaticism and pride. The Heidelberg prisoners, including many of the same women who had cleaned the barracks, were later reassigned to translation work and correspondence for the military government office. Their literacy and clerical skills proved valuable. Some even became early participants in the reconstruction of municipal records, helping rebuild the very system that once imprisoned them. It was, in its own quiet way, an act of redemption through labor. The transformation of their role, from prisoners to administrators of post-war order, symbolized the broader shift of Germany itself, and while no official record acknowledges that the cleaning incident directly influenced policy, oral histories suggest it became part of the unspoken conscience of the occupation force, a moment remembered by those who had seen humiliation turn into humanity. By autumn 1945, Heidelberg's camp population had begun to shrink as repatriation programs expanded. Thousands of German POWs, both men and women, were processed and released after security screening. Many returned to find their towns unrecognizable, their homes requisitioned, their families scattered. Yet for some, captivity had offered something paradoxical. A first encounter with a disciplined but humane authority, one that challenged the ideology they had once served. In interviews decades later, American veterans often recalled those months as the hardest part of their service. Not because of combat, but because of conscience. They had won the war militarily, but were learning how to win it morally. As one former guard put it in a 1974 oral history project, "You start by thinking you're teaching them humility, then you realize you're the one being taught." The lessons of Heidelberg, though never codified in textbooks, became part of the moral DNA of the American occupation. They influenced how future conflicts would be administered, from Korea to Vietnam, where the balance between justice and humanity remained a constant test. And in the quiet routines of post-war camps, the rhythm of scrubbing floors and cleaning barracks had given way to another sound. The hum of typewriters, the shuffle of papers, the slow, administrative rebuilding of a shattered world. But the memory of that first humiliation lingered, not as bitterness, but as a reminder. That dignity, once taken, could only be restored through understanding, not dominance. And that was perhaps the truest aftermath of Heidelberg, Germany, 1946–1950. By the time the first post-war winter arrived, the barracks at Heidelberg had emptied. The fences were dismantled, the watchtowers stripped for lumber, and the once forbidden zone became part of the city's expanding university district. Yet for those who had lived behind the wire, prisoners and guards alike, the camp never truly vanished. It survived in habits, in silence, and in the way people remembered work, discipline, and shame. Across the former American occupation zone, thousands of female POWs returned home with quiet scars. They did not speak of captivity easily. The topic was uncomfortable in a country already struggling with ruins, hunger, and guilt. For most of them, their humiliation was absorbed into a collective silence, overshadowed by the larger narrative of destruction and rebuilding. In post-war Germany, stories of soldiers' heroism were replaced by stories of survival. But women like those at Heidelberg carried a different burden. They had not fought on the front, yet they bore the moral aftermath of a lost war. Many were mothers or widows. They returned to villages where food was scarce, roofs were missing, and neighbors whispered about collaboration and shame. Some joined the vast civilian effort of reconstruction, clearing rubble, restoring water lines, re-establishing schools. Others avoided conversation entirely, turning inward, silent about the months spent in captivity, yet a few began to write. In 1948, a small anthology titled Erinnerungen hinter Stacheldraht, Memories Behind Barbed Wire, circulated privately among women's organizations in the American zone. Within its pages were short recollections, unsigned, cautious, but sincere. One passage, believed to be written by a former Heidelberg internee, read, "We were told to clean the victors' rooms. I remember the wood of the floor, the smell of soap, the sound of music on a foreign radio. I thought of my house in Cologne, burned and gone. For the first time I felt not anger, but the strange peace of knowing that power had changed hands, and that maybe it was right." That sentiment, not of revenge, but of weary acceptance, became emblematic of post-war Germany's internal transformation. The generation that had followed orders without question was now learning, painfully, what moral responsibility meant when obedience was no longer a virtue. In America, meanwhile, the occupation experience became a study in restraint. The U.S. Army's Civil Affairs Division published a series of internal reviews in 1947, emphasizing the importance of dignity, management, the idea that control over an occupied people depended as much on moral authority as on force. Heidelberg was cited indirectly in one such report, under the heading Behavioral Lessons from Field Discipline, U.S. Zone. The report summarized, "Human dignity, once violated, becomes an enduring problem of governance. To rebuild a nation, one must begin with the human spirit. The language was abstract, but the roots were real, drawn from first-hand observations of those who had seen the cost of humiliation and the power of restraint. Academics later called this era Germany's moral reconstruction. It wasn't orchestrated in courtrooms or through ideology, but through daily encounters, prisoners cleaning barracks, guards questioning orders, civilians rediscovering empathy. What happened at Heidelberg was one of countless small laboratories of conscience across occupied Europe. By the 1950s, when the Federal Republic of Germany was established, these experiences had faded into private memory, but their influence persisted in the nation's cultural rebirth. The post-war emphasis on democracy, personal responsibility, and human dignity, enshrined in the new Constitution's Article 1, Die Würde des Menschen ist unantastbar, human dignity is inviolable, echoed, in part, the lessons learned in captivity and occupation. For some of the women who had lived through it, the phrase carried personal weight. They knew what it meant for dignity to be taken, and why it must never be taken again. In 1965, 20 years after the war, a small reunion took place in Heidelberg. It was organized by local historians and attended by surviving American veterans, city officials, and several former German POWs, among them, 2 of the women who had once scrubbed those same barracks floors. A journalist from Der Spiegel covered the gathering, noting the strange mixture of warmth and discomfort. Photographs from that day show handshakes, hesitant smiles, and one image of an American veteran and a German woman standing beside each other, both staring down at the gravel, the same gravel that once divided them. When asked why she had come, the woman replied simply, "Because it happened here. And because we must remember what it means to win and lose as humans, not as nations." That sentence captured what historians would later call the moral residue of victory. It was not guilt, nor forgiveness, but awareness. By the late 20th century, scholars began re-examining the role of women in German captivity, not only as victims but as witnesses to transformation. The Heidelberg episode appeared in several post-Cold War studies as an example of reciprocal humanization, a process where captors and captives learned to see each other beyond ideology. The event's modest documentation, a few Red Cross notes, a handful of diaries, one military memo became the foundation of a story that outlived both sides. Today, the site of the former camp is part of Heidelberg University's science campus. No fence remains, no sign marks what once stood there, but beneath the ground, fragments of concrete foundations still lie undisturbed. Students walk over them unaware. Yet, in the archives nearby, the records remain: faded papers, dated signatures, and that one brief line in a 1945 report, "Discipline maintained, work completed without protest," a small sentence that carried, quietly, the echo of an empire's fall and humanity's slow return. And so, the humiliation that began as punishment became, in hindsight, a lesson, a mirror through which both sides glimpsed their own fragility. For the women who lived it, it was a passage through shame toward understanding. For the Americans who ordered it, a confrontation with conscience. For history, a reminder that the true aftermath of war is not victory. It is recognition. The war had ended, but its silence lingered. Not the silence of peace, but of realization. In the quiet routines of post-war Germany, amid ruins and rebuilding, people began to understand that victory and defeat were not opposites. They were reflections of the same human condition: pride, fear, endurance, and above all, dignity. The story of those women at Heidelberg was never written in history books. It had no medals, no declarations, no heroes. Yet it contained something more lasting than triumph. The moment when power met humility, and both recognized each other as human. They were not symbols of shame, nor subjects of pity. They were participants in a transformation that no treaty could enforce. The moral awakening that follows catastrophe. Their humiliation, witnessed in silence by young American soldiers who had just won a world war, became a small thread in the vast tapestry of human conscience, a reminder that compassion often begins where pride ends. History tends to remember the thunder of war, the generals, the battles, the victories. But the true pulse of civilization is found in the quiet aftermaths. A broom sweeping across a wooden floor, a soldier's journal filled with uneasy reflections, a prisoner's understanding that dignity, once taken, can be rebuilt through decency. The Heidelberg camp is gone now, its fences replaced by classrooms, its gravel paths paved over, but its legacy lives on in the subtle shift of human perspective it inspired. It whispered to both sides that mercy is not weakness, and that the measure of civilization is not how it fights, but how it forgives. When we speak of the end of World War II, we often picture flags and celebrations, yet the real ending, the one that shaped hearts and nations, happened quietly, in places like Heidelberg, not in parades, but in moments of reflection, where victors and vanquished alike saw themselves reflected in the same fragile light. For those women, the war ended not with surrender, but with understanding. And in that understanding, born of humiliation, labor, and conscience, humanity found its way back from the ruins.